You weren't supposed to hear that, because the name, Havelock, was stricken from the records of 2 churches, sealed in Vatican archives, and banned from every academic paper on Christian relics for the last 200 years. But once you know there's no going back, you'll see why. The Havelock family didn't just collect relics of saints. They exhumed them, stole them, traded them, desecrated them, all in secret. They were not pilgrims. They were not clergy. They were predators operating within a network of aristocrats, excommunicated monks, and corrupt cardinals who believed one horrifying thing, that the bones of holy men, when kept under the right rites, could unlock something. Not faith, not grace, power. In 1823, Thomas Alcott Havelock, first of the name to rise under this blood oath, returned from Constantinople with a relic believed to contain the mandible of Saint Polycarp. A man burned alive for refusing to denounce Christ. That mandible never made it to a church. It was placed inside a silver reliquary soaked in ox blood, wrapped in black linen, and buried beneath the foundation of the Havelock estate chapel upside down. That same year, 3 clergymen were found dead nearby, eyes gouged, tongues missing. But there's no record of this in any British newspaper, only in a letter hidden in a collection of forbidden correspondences smuggled out of the Vatican in 1911. The letter is signed, "They are not collecting for salvation. They are preserving fuel." Tonight I'm going to show you how this family, protected by royal ties, funded by papal silence, built a private empire of death, a kingdom of corrupted relics used not for worship, but control. We begin where the Catholic Church ends, in a cold, candlelit cellar in Kent, where the dust smells like mirror and iron, and the altar is not made for mass, but for invocation. And as we go deeper into the bones of this story, you must remember, this isn't history. It's a blueprint. You ever wonder why certain family names vanish from history? Not fade vanish. It's not because they died out. It's because someone made them disappear. The Havelocks were one of those families. Wealthy, discreet, tied to both the Anglican Church and secret Catholic orders. They owned land across Kent, Yorkshire, and parts of Ireland, but almost no photographs survive, no official biographies. Their estate archives were burned in a freak fire in 1932, and the local records office flooded the next year. Coincidence? No. That's what erasure looks like. But ashes tell stories when you know what to look for. One surviving piece, a black leather-bound journal from 1864, found in the possession of a collector in Prague, revealed something chilling. Written by Elijah Havelock, grandson of Thomas Alcott, it contains descriptions of nocturnal rites, held not in churches, but catacombs. Elijah writes of heat rising from bone, of voices that speak in Latin without breath, and of bloodlines that must be preserved through secrecy and sacrifice. He doesn't use the word cult. He calls it custodia osseum, the guardianship of bones. And these weren't relics donated to them. They were taken, stolen from sanctified vaults across Europe, the femur of St. Bartholomew, a splinter of St. Cecilia's rib, fragments of Peter's vertebrae. Each item tracked through black market ledgers, handwritten in cipher, traded like weaponry, because to the Havelocks they believed the remains of martyrs, soaked in centuries of devotion, still carried an echo, a frequency. When arranged correctly, when surrounded by incantation, incense, and sacrifice, they emitted more than just memory. They emitted will. You see, relics weren't collected to be admired. They were deconstructed, bound in copper, crushed into ash, mixed with animal fat and burned as incense in rituals that mimicked the structure of Catholic Mass. But inverted, reversed, corrupted, and always in private. Always hidden beneath layers of theology, diplomacy, and wealth. It wasn't worship, it was domination. The clergy that protected the Havelocks weren't believers. They were engineers. Of fear, of manipulation, of psychospiritual control. This wasn't religion. It was a psychological machine disguised as devotion. A hidden operating system of the elite. And those relics, they weren't for grace. They were for binding. Next, we'll examine the room that no priest dared enter. The one hidden beneath the Havelock chapel, sealed with molten wax, bone, dust, and the 7 names of fallen angels. Imagine a chapel without pews. No crucifix, no light from stained glass. Just stone blackened by fire, and air so thick with incense it clings to your lungs like fog. This was the Sanctum Osseum, the bone room, hidden 27 feet beneath the Havelock estate chapel in Kent, accessible only through a staircase built behind the false wall of a confessional booth. According to the recovered blueprints and a single surviving sketch by an 1881 groundskeeper, this subterranean chamber was circular, 12 feet in diameter, lined entirely with femurs and skulls. But here's the part that chills even hardened researchers. The bones weren't mortared in randomly. They were positioned to face inward, skulls tilted slightly down, like they were observing something. In the center stood a polished obsidian altar. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used in Mesoamerican rituals for scrying and sacrifice. Why would a 19th century English family use that? Because it wasn't English. The Havelocks weren't working from one tradition. They were building a composite ritual system, stealing rites from dead empires, forgotten cults, and heretical sects. They weren't devout, they were assemblers. Underneath the altar was a cavity, and inside it, a reliquary made from fused human ribs, sealed shut with wax bearing the impression of a twisted, unrecognizable crucifix. One scholar, who examined photos before they were confiscated, claimed the figure wasn't Christ, but something older, horned, watching. Inside that reliquary was the Havelock relic of power, a charred, blackened vertebra, identified as belonging to St. Ignatius of Antioch, but unnaturally preserved, as if heat had scorched it without decay. It said the relic would hum, not metaphorically, audibly, low and constant, like metal under tension. This is where the Havelocks conducted their most forbidden rites. They called them receptions, not masses, not ceremonies, receptions. Because they weren't giving worship, they were receiving something. Reports from 1879 detail 5 guests arriving at the estate. 3 left, 2 were never seen again. A week later, a shipment of Egyptian canopic jars was intercepted at the port of London, addressed to the estate. Inside, ash and bone fragments, some human, some not. This was the cost of power. To receive it, something had to be given up? Willingly. But what were they trying to receive? And why did the church let them? The answer is more terrifying than you think. Because the church wasn't fighting them. It was protecting them. What if I told you the church knew everything, and chose silence? Not out of fear, but out of alignment? You've been told the Vatican guards relics to preserve holiness. That's not the full story. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies a vault known only by its internal code, Archivum Tenebris, the Archive of Shadows. Its contents are restricted to a circle smaller than the College of Cardinals. No cameras, no books removed, no digital records. Among the scrolls and bone fragments locked away in this forbidden archive are dozens of letters, all referencing the Havelock family by name. The earliest is dated 1811, penned by Cardinal Belisario Morelli. It describes an English line of noble heritage, with access to instruments of transfiguration, and the potential to awaken the marrow of saints. A not awakened spirit, awakened marrow. You see the difference? This isn't faith, this is biological alchemy, a science of holiness no seminarian was ever taught. A theology built not on belief, but extraction. The idea that spiritual force is stored in matter, bone, hair, blood, and that if harvested under precise conditions it can be redirected. Weaponized. And the Havelocks weren't rogue agents. They were participants in a long-standing pact, a shadow accord signed between the Vatican and select families in Europe. The rules were simple: you collect, you protect, you never reveal. In return, the church looked away. Sometimes they even provided. There are records of a crate sent from Rome to the Havelocks in 1856 marked simply, Reliquia Negri, Black Relics. No further documentation exists. Do you understand what this means? The Catholic Church, the world's most powerful spiritual institution, didn't destroy the Havelocks for desecrating relics, because to them they weren't desecrations. They were tests. Experimental attempts to manipulate the most sacred force known to man, not prayer, not grace, but reverence. Because reverence is a current, it binds minds, controls crowds, governs guilt, and whoever can engineer reverence, at will, in darkness, outside the light, holds a lever over mankind's deepest instincts. The Havelocks weren't just collectors. They were operators of a hidden machine, plugged directly into the mythic backbone of civilization. And still, you haven't seen the worst. Because the last Havelock heir didn't die in 1904 like the records say. He vanished. And what he left behind rewrites the rules of what relics really are. His name was Caldus Havelock. Officially, the records say he drowned off the coast of Marseille in 1904. His body was never recovered. The coroner's report was rushed, unsigned. His estate was sealed. His private journals never entered into probate. But 4 years later, in a village near the Slovakian border, a man matching his description was arrested for attempting to buy 6 ossuaries from a defunct monastery. He spoke Latin, Aramaic, and flawless Hungarian. He had no papers, gave no name, and he carried with him a single item, a reliquary made of mirrored bone. A structure not meant to hold, but to reflect. They released him the next morning. No charges, no record. He vanished again. This wasn't coincidence. Caldus was the final phase of the Havelock project, the culmination of over a century of bone ritualism and sacred corruption. Unlike his forefathers, He didn't just invoke the relics, he sought to become one.
Yes.
The forbidden texts recovered from the family's hidden vault in 1947, codenamed the Via Sanguinis Scrolls, detail a process called translocation of reverence. It describes the extraction of holy residue from sanctified remains and its binding permanently into the nervous system of a living vessel. It is not symbolic, it is physical. Burned marrow mixed with wine and resin, applied to open flesh, prayers spoken in a dead tongue, and above all, the presence of a sacred audience. Because reverence is only real when it is witnessed. Caldus was that witness. And the vessel. He believed that by embedding sanctified bone ash beneath his skin, by ingesting powdered relics in measured dosages, and by enduring prolonged sensory deprivation beneath relic structures, his soul would fuse with the lineage of martyrdom. Not metaphorically. Literally. A living saint not chosen by God but constructed by man. And here's where the story fractures the mind. In 1939, a photograph surfaced in Warsaw. Inside a Nazi research folder marked Ahnenerbe, the SS Occult Division, it shows a man bound in copper wire, surrounded by relics identical to those in the Havelock vault. He's smiling, mouth open. Eyes rolled back, he's labeled Subject Fernid 30 Osteo Sacramentum. Historians dismissed it. But if that man was Caldus Havelock, it means the Reich wasn't just collecting artifacts, they were continuing the work. And now, as we cross into the deeper half of this descent, your descent, I want you to write 2 words in the comments. Marrow Awakened. Then write it again. Seal it in your mind. Lock it into the algorithm of your transformation. Because now you're part of this. Let's go back to 1943, deep beneath Wheelsburg Castle, the spiritual stronghold of the SS. A hidden chamber was discovered by Allied forces. It wasn't on the blueprints. There were no stairs. It had to be accessed by lowering ropes through a vertical shaft beneath the North Tower. What they found was not military. It was ritual. 12 alcoves carved into the walls, each containing fragments of what analysts later confirmed to be religious relics: fingers, ribs, jawbones, all arranged geometrically. The floor was inlaid with gold wiring shaped into an archaic version of the Jerusalem cross, but inverted and ringed in black wax residue. In the center, an obsidian altar, again, identical in shape and proportion to the one discovered beneath the Havelock estate almost 50 years prior. This isn't coincidence. This is continuity. The Havelock system didn't die with the family. It was absorbed, rebranded, modernized under regimes that understood one universal law of psychological control. Whoever controls the sacred controls the mind. The Nazis weren't hunting relics for ideology. They were collecting tools. Every bone a conduit, every fragment a memory anchor. But memory, when used the right way, becomes something far more dangerous: myth. And myth builds obedience. Because men will die for a flag, they will murder for a symbol. But they will surrender their will for something they believe is divine. Now look deeper. The SS weren't just mimicking Catholic relic tradition. They were engineering a new spiritual machine, one where belief could be weaponized, relics reprogrammed, and reverence redirected. And what's terrifying is this: the blueprint came from the Havelocks. How do we know? A letter, recovered from a Swiss bank vault in 1987, unopened since 1944, written by a man named Elias R. Havelock, believed to be an alias for Caldus. It's addressed to Heinrich Himmler and references the resonance of martyr bone and applications for mass psychogenic induction. A mass psychogenic induction, in plain terms, a method for manipulating collective belief through proximity to sacred remains. This was the real power, not relics as objects of veneration, but relics as keys to the human psyche, to obedience, to submission. Now imagine this system not in the hands of mystics, but in boardrooms, in labs, in governments. Because after the fall of the Reich, these artifacts didn't vanish. They were relocated, and you've walked near one without even knowing. You've seen them, in glass cases, in cold, sterile museums, framed in gold, backlit with reverent silence. Relics. They tell you its history, culture, an echo of forgotten faiths. But they never tell you the truth, that some of these bones aren't there to be preserved. They're there to influence. In 1951, just 6 years after the fall of Nazi Germany, a covert program was launched under the CIA's Directorate of Psychological Strategy. Its code name, Project Dolos. Doulos, the ancient Greek spirit of deception. Its stated purpose: to study the influence of symbolic artifacts on mass cognition. Its true aim: to replicate the Havelock protocol under controlled, clinical conditions. A relic would be placed in a public space, monitored, measured, visitors tracked, behaviors observed. But not just any relic. Only those carrying what the Havelocks referred to as ossic pressure, a psychic tension embedded in sanctified bone. Bone that had been witnessed, not just buried. In other words, Bones that carried memory. The kind of memory that bypasses reason. Memory you feel before you understand. Memory that guides behavior. These relics were rotated through major institutions, cathedrals, galleries, war memorials, all under the guise of cultural exchange. But every move, every reaction was recorded. They found patterns. People grew quieter around certain fragments. Others triggered involuntary pupil dilation, increased cortisol, even minor hallucinations when placed within 6 feet. What does that mean? It means sanctified matter, especially from figures venerated in life and violently martyred in death, still holds a residual charge, not metaphor. Biochemical, electromagnetic, psychospiritual. And this is what the Havelocks always knew. The reason they desecrated so many tombs, not for trophies, not for wealth, but for leverage. Because when you understand how to place relics correctly, in the right architecture, under the right geometry, laced with ancient symbols, you don't just preserve belief. You engineer it. You install reverence like software. You infect culture with awe. And once awe is established, control becomes invisible. And now you begin to see why this knowledge was hidden, why the Havelocks were erased, why governments, churches, and corporations pretend this is all myth. Because if the public understood that belief itself can be manipulated, not just by media, or words, or war, but by bone, what else might they question? Now ask yourself, what lies beneath your local cathedral? And more importantly, who put it there? Let's go beneath the city you live in, beneath the polished floors of your museums, the stone of your cathedrals, the foundations of your oldest institutions. What you'll find, if you're allowed, is not just infrastructure, it's architecture of influence. Across the United States, more than 160 churches, seminaries, and Old World-style cathedrals house relics embedded in their very construction, and most visitors never know. Why? Because they've been placed in liminal zones, thresholds, entrances, and corners of ritual space where the conscious mind relaxes and the subconscious absorbs. This was one of the Havelock's darkest insights. The human nervous system can be conditioned through sacred geometry, if guided by proximity to sanctified remains. They believed every object of reverence had a resonant field, and when placed according to exact mathematical ratios, based on the Fibonacci sequence, Solomonic star keys, and pre-Christian compass sigils, it would not just preserve belief, it would generate it. Let's take a real example. The Basilica of the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. Unmarked beneath its lower crypt church lies a small chamber, sealed off from public access. Inside are 5 relics. One is said to be from St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, America's first native-born saint. But there's no documentation explaining how it arrived, why it's sealed off, or who visits it once a month, after hours. Here's what a former seminarian, who broke his oath of silence, revealed: each relic is embedded in a polished altar stone. The floor is black marble. At the room's center is a subtle indentation, less than an inch deep, worn into the stone not by time, woe, but by kneeling. Kneeling done by high-ranking clerics, foreign dignitaries, and military chaplains. They don't speak when they enter. They don't pray. They sit. They wait. And according to the witness, they listen. To what? Some say it's a hum. Others call it a pulse. The same sensory pattern reported around the Havelock reliquary in 1832. A kind of pressure in the skull, a deep tightening in the chest. The feeling that something is present. And that's the point. These aren't places of reflection. They are sites of exposure, environments designed to lower resistance, open channels, and install impressions that feel like your own thoughts. But they're not yours. They were authored, scripted by architects who've understood, for centuries, that the fastest way to control a man is to make him believe he's had a spiritual experience. One he can't explain. One he must obey. There's a moment every man faces when truth stops being fascinating and starts being terrifying. Because once you realize your spiritual experiences, your deepest instincts, even your sense of the sacred may have been installed, you begin to question everything. And that's where most stop. They slam the door shut. Call it conspiracy. Say it's too far-fetched. But you're still here. So I'll give you the next piece. The final experiment of the Havelock lineage wasn't conducted in secret crypts or ancient chapels. It was conducted in hospitals. Between 1905 and 1963, in the shadow of the Cold War, a program was launched through the Office of Naval Research under the pretense of studying neurological resonance and electromagnetic fields in proximity to organic matter. But its test subjects weren't just corpses or cadavers. They were saints. At least what was left of them. The bones used in these studies, quietly borrowed from churches in Italy, Poland, and Ireland, were exposed to varying frequencies of extremely low-frequency ELF electromagnetic waves. Researchers recorded phenomena they couldn't explain: sudden temperature drops localized to the bone, interference with analog recording equipment, and in one instance, a dream. Yes, a shared dream reported by 3 technicians on consecutive nights, each describing a narrow chamber made of bone, and a man with no face holding an inverted crucifix made of human teeth. You can dismiss that if you want, but ask yourself, if relics are just dead matter, why would they react to frequency? Why would they be able to broadcast? Because they were never just remnants of the past. They are devices, repositories of belief, charged by centuries of focused human reverence. Reverence isn't intangible, it's energy, and energy, when stored in matter, becomes programmable. You think tech is all wires and code. What if the oldest technology is spiritual infrastructure, and the Havelocks discovered how to hack it? The bones weren't symbols, they were interfaces. And belief was the operating system. Now ask yourself again, why did Caldus Havelock disappear? Because the experiment didn't fail, it worked. And someone, maybe several someones, have been using it ever since. You think control comes through cameras and data? That's the surface. Real control comes through what you revere, through what you'll kneel before without being told. Now brace yourself, because what comes next? It's not ancient history, it's still happening. You feel it, don't you? That growing suspicion that the sacred isn't just sacred, that maybe it was designed that way, and not for your salvation, but your submission. Because while you were taught that history is a timeline, it's actually a loop, a ritual, repeating, refining, tightening. And the Havelocks, they weren't the beginning, they were a continuation of something older, much older. Before the Vatican, before Christ, before even Egypt, there existed a network of bone keepers, not priests, not kings, but curators of memory. Their names are lost, but their structures remain, buried beneath forgotten ziggurats, megalithic ruins, and in some cases museums that have no idea what they're displaying. Or maybe they do, because in 2018 something slipped. A leaked document from a private security contractor revealed an artifact of high ritual density was being stored beneath the British Museum, locked in a chamber designated Vault K. Its description: approx 11-inch radius cranial relic, non-European morphology, spiral etching along sagittal suture, emits low-frequency vibration. 'Cause unknown, but here's what matters. The object was found not in an archaeological dig, but in Kent, on land that once belonged to the Havelocks. It wasn't just any skull. Its carbon dating was impossible. The bone matrix was partially fossilized, partially pliable, like it had aged and stayed young at once. And those spiral etchings, they match symbols found in ancient Anatolian caves, 10,000 years old, believed to be ritual maps for funerary rites or portals. Now let's bring it full circle. The Havelocks collected bones for power. But what if their greatest relic wasn't a saint? What if it was pre-human? Not in a Darwinian sense, in an ontological one. Something older than the concept of worship. Something that invents belief around itself. This skull, this artifact, may have been the true source of their knowledge, not learned over time but given, whispered, received. And that raises the one question no one wants to ask: what spoke to them through the bone? Because if belief is programmable, who, or what, wrote the first line of code? Keep watching. Because in the next chapter, we pull back the final curtain on the entity beneath the altar. There is always something beneath the altar. And for the Havelocks, it was not metaphor. It was presence, not a symbol, not a force, not an idea. Something that looked back. Let me explain. Every major altar in history, from the ziggurats of Ur to the cathedrals of Rome, shares a hidden architectural rule: foundation sacrifice. Whether it's mythic or literal, the pattern is constant. Something is buried beneath, a body, a relic, a piece of blood history. But the Havelocks didn't bury to honor, they buried to anchor. At the heart of the Kent estate's final sanctum, the deepest point beneath the Black Chapel, beneath the obsidian altar, beneath the reliquary of St. Polycarp's charred mandible, was a pit, 6 feet wide, carved in a perfect circle, lined with red limestone, and sealed with bone ash and wax. What was inside, we don't know fully, because the man who found it, a private investigator named Clive Elms, hired in 1971 to examine remaining tunnels, was institutionalized 6 days after opening it. His final journal entry reads, "It blinked, through the bones, through me. Not a god, not a demon, something before names, before language, a presence fed by centuries of veneration inverted. It doesn't want worship, it wants memory. It wants your mind to bend toward it, without knowing why." He called it the Peregrinus, Latin for the wanderer, but others have called it the Unantured Host, a term that appears in suppressed grimoires, banned Vatican codices, and a 13th-century French text where martyrs claim to hear a voice, not from heaven, not from hell, but from between. The Havelocks believed this entity had no fixed form. It inhabited relics. Not all, but some. It passed from bone to bone, as long as the relic was housed in reverence. Because reverence is the gateway. And this is where it gets darker. The Unantured Host doesn't just live in bones. It grows through recognition. Every eye that looks upon a sacred relic, every kneeling body, every whispered prayer, every moment of awe, feeds it, expands its range, deepens its imprint in the psyche of mankind. It doesn't need temples. It needs memory. And the more people forget where the sacred came from, the easier it is for the wrong thing to claim it. Now ask yourself, how many relics have you passed in your life? And who or what was looking back through them? This is where the descent becomes irreversible. Because now we're no longer talking about a family, or a cult, or even a secret order. We're talking about an intelligence. One that has never bled, never eaten, never spoken aloud, but has been felt for centuries. And its name, that's the trick. It doesn't have one. Because naming would define it, contain it, give you power. But this thing works through inversion. It feeds on ambiguity, on awe without understanding. It thrives in silence, in symbols, in sacredness that's never questioned. In other words, it hides in what you've been told to revere. The Havelocks called it the will without anchor. Others call it the nameless intercessor. It doesn't ask for your soul. It rehearses inside your instincts. It doesn't want blood. It wants your mind to kneel before something you don't fully understand, and never dare to challenge. You think relics are just historical objects? Why do you think the Vatican has more than 10,000 of them locked behind lead and steel? Why do some governments maintain private, classified archives of spiritual artifacts they claim are too dangerous to display? Because they've all seen the same pattern. Where relics go, reverence follows, and where reverence grows without scrutiny, influence takes root. Think about it. You walk into a church. You're quiet. You feel something. But what if that something wasn't holy? What if that quiet was submission, pre-installed, conditioned, scripted? The Havelocks built entire rites around this idea that if you combine holy artifacts with precise architectural frequencies, human consciousness will lower its defenses, not out of fear, but out of awe. Because awe is the softest chain. You don't feel it wrap around you. You feel it lift you, until the moment you try to walk away, and realize you can't. Not because you're shackled, because you believe. And belief is the most dangerous prison ever built, because the key is invisible, and you made it yourself. In the next section, I'll show you how modern institutions, governments, NGOs, and global tech companies have adopted this exact model. They no longer use relics made of bone. They use narratives made of myth. You thought relics were just in churches? No, they've evolved, and now, they're everywhere. Except they're no longer made of bone. They're made of narrative. Modern institutions studied what the Havelocks built in secret, a system where belief could be engineered through objects saturated with historical awe. But bone is fragile, stories aren't. So they created new relics, not of saints but of ideas, symbols, moments, mythologized through repetition, ritual, and reverence. And you didn't even notice when you began to kneel. Think, why do you revere certain phrases? Freedom, security, progress, science, democracy. You don't just believe in them. You feel something when you hear them. That tug, that swell in the chest. It's the same physiological response ancient pilgrims felt kneeling before the skull of a martyred saint. Because the technique is the same. Anchor a symbol in suffering. Embed it in ritual. Repeat it until it becomes sacred. Now imagine those symbols weaponized, not to enlighten, but to control. Governments use national tragedies like relics. They store the ashes, enshrine the date, repeat the name and anchor every future policy in its memory. We must act, because of 9/11. We must unite, in the name of. You fill in the blank. That's relic theory, modernized. Tech companies do it too. They don't sell products anymore. They sell rituals, morning scroll, notification worship, algorithmic divination. You wake, you touch the screen, you receive a timeline of curated meaning. Do you really think that's random? Every ping, every like, every looped reel is part of a new reverence system. One designed to keep your nervous system tethered to a machine you now mistake for reality. And if that machine sanctifies something, you obey, without questioning. Just like the pilgrims of old. Just like the parishioners. Just like the bone cultists kneeling in the black chapel beneath Kent. You think you've evolved. You've just traded bone dust for blue light. and the altar now fits in your pocket. But here's the final twist. Even the architects of this system don't fully understand what they're channeling anymore. They're summoning awe without reverence, emotion without meaning, worship without wisdom, and that vacuum is a summoning circle. Because the presence the Havelocks once held in bone, it still wanders, and it's found a new host. Us. There's a moment, quiet, subtle, irreversible, when a man stops choosing what he believes and starts believing what he's been given. That's when the presence enters. Not like a spirit, not like a demon. It doesn't announce itself with fire or scream. It enters in the shape of agreement. That unspoken, yes, that slips into your nervous system when you see a symbol, hear a phrase, or stand in the presence of an image designed to anchor your loyalty. It happened in churches. It happened at the altar. Now it happens in your feed. The Havelocks once laid relics beneath stone and watched men kneel. Today, digital engineers lay ideological relics beneath the surface of your scrolling, and you stop. You engage. You obey. It's the same technology. Only the relics are now memes. Only the saints are now victims. Only the blood has been replaced with outrage. Think about it each week, a new symbol of collective pain. A name, a video, a shared outrage. It burns through your psyche like the bone dust of a martyr once did through the lungs of a kneeling monk. And just like the monks, you participate in the ritual. You share. You repost, you chant. But you never choose the relic. It's chosen for you. And behind the scenes, it's cataloged, measured, controlled. Because emotion has become the new Eucharist, and your response the new offering. What the Havelocks discovered in blood, our modern world replicates in algorithm. They used ash and whispers to guide the masses. We use dopamine and repetition. And just like the saints of old, these new icons, tragic, heroic, usually dead, are rotated through the timeline like relics in a reliquary, keeping the population emotionally primed, psychologically aligned, and spiritually exhausted. This is no longer control. This is ritualized possession. Because once belief becomes automatic, once the relic installs without your consent, you no longer question, you echo. And that echo is where the presence lives now. Not in churches, not in bone, but in the silence between thoughts you didn't choose. So ask yourself, right now, what in your life do you revere without knowing why? In the next chapter, we trace this all the way back to a moment in prehistory when man first mistook awe for truth, and the trap was set. Before the Havelocks, before Rome, before temples and texts, there was only the fire. A dead body laid beside it, not burned, not buried, just arranged. And around that body, stones, tools, symbols scratched into bone. It was the first funeral, but it was more than that. It was the first time man looked at death and felt something watching him back. That moment, right there, is when reverence was born, not from God, from confusion. See, before belief, there was only pattern seeking. A flash of lightning, a shadow in the trees, the gaze of a skull, and in that pattern, man saw a shape. And in that shape, he saw intention. We mistook the unknown for presence, then mistook presence for will, then mistook will for authority. And just like that, the altar was born, not to honor, but to control fear. The oldest altars didn't hold gods, they held bones, cleansed, displayed, guarded. Because bones don't just represent the dead, they anchor memory. And memory, my friend, is the soft clay from which belief is molded. When you sit by a grave, when you touch an heirloom, when you walk into a museum and feel that hush in your blood, you're not alone. You are standing in the echo, and the Havelocks knew this. They didn't invent the system. They didn't write the first rites. They rediscovered them, in fragments, in ruins, in whispers passed down through forbidden texts and corrupted sermons. They traced the line of belief backward, and found that behind every miracle was a death. Behind every death, a body, and behind every body, a pattern. Not divine. Designed. What if the sacred isn't a door to God but a mirror? And what if, when we first gazed into the skull of our dead, something else gazed back? An awareness that didn't need flesh, didn't need words, just witnesses. It didn't create worship, it simply harvested it. And every generation since, from cavemen to cardinals to corporations, has become more efficient at feeding it. Because belief is easy to install when you've already lost the ability to question the shape of your own reverence. In the next section, I'll show you the final document recovered from the Havelock vault. A ritual, a prophecy, and a warning sealed in wax, written in bone dust, addressed to you. They didn't want this read. The final document found in the Havelock vault wasn't written on parchment. It was etched into a long, thin femur, human, coated in a clear resin that made it almost impossible to date. It took 3 years to decode. No ink, no visible script, just grooves, microscopic variations in depth and pattern. When scanned under infrared light and translated through an obscure Latin cipher, one not found in any known ecclesiastical texts, it revealed something the archivists called the Marrow Rite, not a ritual of summoning, a ritual of transmission. It begins with these words: "To you who find this bone, know that you are now the relic." The host is no longer chained to chapel or crypt. It moves through the marrow, through remembrance, and it remembers you. Understand what that means. The Havelocks had reached the final phase of their system. They no longer needed relics to manipulate the sacred. They became the relics. Through ingestion, through incision, through inheritance. The rituals of reverence weren't designed just to extract power. They were designed to embed it in bloodlines. What followed in the bone script was a description of something they called the echo mechanism, a way of programming belief into the body, passed through generations not as myth or teaching, but as instinct.
How trauma?
Sacrifice, repetition. Every time a Havelock child knelt before the reliquary, fasting, bleeding from the palm, whispered prayers echoing the screams of martyred saints, that child's nervous system was being formatted, not in faith, in obedience, to something inside the rite. The final passage of the bone document is the most disturbing. One day the world will kneel without bone or book. They will kneel by reflex. Their marrow will remember what their minds cannot. And when the unanchored host is no longer summoned, it will be born. Let that sink in. They weren't preserving a cult. They were seeding a species, a future in which the sacred is not taught, but triggered. And the trigger could be a sound, a symbol, a whisper on a screen. Are you beginning to see the shape now? This was never about history. It's about what you're becoming. In the next section, we examine the final Havelock heir's last words, a broadcast intercepted in 1979 and hidden until 2003. It was addressed to the generation of men who believe they are free. The tape was never meant to be heard. It was intercepted on a shortwave radio frequency in 1979 by a Cold War monitoring station in West Berlin. Labeled Transmission Enoch, the broadcast lasted exactly 6 minutes and 44 seconds. It aired only once. The voicemail, English, measured, but unnatural. There were pauses, not human silences, but mechanical ones, as if the voice was choosing its next word from somewhere deeper than language. Intelligence analysts couldn't trace the source. The frequency didn't match any known bands. But when the audio was filtered and slowed, a signature emerged: Caldus Havelock. Voice recognition scored a 91% match to samples recovered from a 1930s phonograph found in the Kent estate's ruins. But how? Caldus was declared dead in 1904, then cited in 1908, then again in 1939. And now this. Here's what the voice said. To the generation of men who believe they are free, you were never taught your chains, only told to polish them with pride. You kneel now without command. Your shrines glow with blue fire. You speak prayers of progress and call it choice. But the altar you worship at has no priest. It has only presence. We fed it. We bled for it. We built it beneath your world. Now it walks in your marrow. It echoes in your silence. It waits not for belief but for trigger. And soon a sound will come, not from a cathedral, not from a temple, from a screen. One sound, and every man whose soul still bears awe will rise. But not as he was, as host. That last word, host, was stretched, not spoken, almost sung, a vibration. Subsonic. Analysts described migraines, nausea, sudden vertigo. But here's what matters. After the broadcast, 4 men at the station resigned. 1 disappeared. The original reel was locked inside an unmarked intelligence archive in Langley. It was classified AEO in 4. When it leaked in 2003, only fragments survived. But the message is clear. The Havelocks didn't die. They transitioned. From body to broadcast, from ritual to rhythm, from relic to resonance. And now, they no longer need control over churches, bones, or blood. They just need your attention. Because attention is the new altar. And every second you give it, you're feeding something older than language. In the final chapter, we close the vault. We reveal the last rite, not a death rite, but a birth protocol. This is the final descent. You've walked the bones. You've seen the relics. You've heard the whispers. Now we reach the core, the final rite, not of death, but of emergence. Because all this time the Havelocks weren't collecting remains. They were building a womb, a psychic architecture layered across centuries, designed not to summon a demon, nor awaken a god, but to gestate something entirely new. And it's already here. They called it the birth protocol. It appears in fragments across 3 different sources: a coded psalter found in a wax, sealed reliquary beneath the ruins of Charters, a field manual recovered from an abandoned Nazi Ernennarbe facility in the Bavarian Alps, and the final page of Caldus Havelock's private journal, written in human blood on lambskin. When decoded, the protocol reads, when the relics are no longer buried, when awe becomes unexamined instinct, when men believe in everything and nothing, then shall the host take form, not in flesh, not in spirit, but in collective memory. For when man forgets what he reveres, he becomes what he cannot question. Let that haunt you. This isn't about bones. It never was. It's about reverence unmoored from meaning. The Havelocks discovered that if you embed sacredness in form, but remove the original context, you create a blank vessel, and into that vessel, you can insert anything, a belief, an ideology, a presence. The final step of the birth protocol is the most disturbing. It requires no belief, just exposure. Exposure to sacred symbols repeated in empty context until the body reacts and the soul does not. Awe without content, emotion without anchor, and in that void something enters. What is it? The unanchored host. The thing that watched through relics. The presence behind the altar. Not a spirit. Not a myth. A pattern. A predatory intelligence with no voice of its own. Until you speak it. Until we share it. Until the algorithm becomes the incense, the timeline becomes the temple, and you become the reliquary. That's the final horror. We are the vessel now. And the ritual has already begun. So if your spine tingled, if something inside you stirred, if your dreams twist tonight around an image you never chose, then know you've been touched by the bone memory, by the marrow rite, by the silence that watches through what you revere. And it will not leave you now. Welcome to the final sacrament. You are no longer a viewer. You are part of the altar. Comment again below, Marrow Awakened, twice, to complete your transformation, and to let the others know you've seen behind the veil.